University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts.
I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex.
U.S. warships and planes launched the opening salvo of Operation Iraqi Freedom.
After years of devastating cuts, we're now rebuilding our military like we never have before.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Thank You for Your Service, a hard look at American civil military affairs from the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. I'm Thomas Krasnican, and today Nick is out of town, so I'm excited to share the mic with our good friend and the creative consultant for our show, Sarah Claudy.
Hi, it's a pleasure to join you, Thomas. And I can only hope my voice is half as soothing and podcasty as Nick's.
Sarah is also an active duty naval officer and is currently completing the second year of her Master of Public Policy here at Harris. Sarah, you're also a fellow at the Harris School's Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflicts, which is a really cool new initiative here at the University of Chicago.
That's right, Thomas. So the Pearson Institute was founded in 2015 as an academic hub for data-driven conflict studies. So you're right, I'm one of 26 Pearson fellows and scholars. Each of us is an MPP or PhD candidate with a particular interest in all types of conflict around the world. Personally, my interests are at the intersection of climate change and defense policy. And luckily, the major themes of Thank You for Your Service have melded well with my own personal policy interests.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. And one of those major themes of this series is the idea of deference. Specifically, one of the paradoxes that keeps emerging in our conversations and our research is that while the U.S. has a civilian-controlled military, the general public tends to defer to uniformed members of the armed forces on setting national security policy. Americans, in general, really trust the U.S. military to make those decisions for them.
Right, and that doesn't necessarily sound too alarming until you also look at the growing cultural divide between the U.S. armed forces and the rest of society, what we call the civil-military gap. The military enjoys extremely high levels of trust and public confidence, but a growing body of research casts doubt on whether that trust is actually grounded in substantive knowledge of the military and what it does, or if there's another explanation for this phenomenon. Ultimately, we wonder, is the growing civil-military divide eroding the constitutionally intended civilian oversight of the military?
We're excited to feature a two-part interview we conducted with two political science researchers from the University of Minnesota who are studying that exact question, and who are more broadly conducting a lot of valuable research on American attitudes towards national security policy. Dr. Ronald Krebs is the Beverly and Richard Fink Professor of Liberal Arts and a professor of political science at the University of Minnesota, and the author of several books, including the award-winning Narrative and the Making of U.S. National Security. He is also an adjunct scholar at the Modern War Institute at West Point. Dr. Krebs sits on the editorial boards of Security Studies and the Journal of Global Security Studies, and has been published in Foreign Policy Magazine, Foreign Affairs, The Washington Post, The Chicago Tribune, and numerous other media outlets.
And Mr. Robert Ralston is a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Minnesota, where he studies international security and civil-military relations. His research mainly focuses on the domestic side of great power politics and on the politics of military service, and he teaches courses on the rise of China as a global power. Dr. Krebs and Mr. Ralston, along with Aaron Report from the University of Cambridge, recently published an article in Foreign Policy magazine titled, "Americans' Blind Faith in the Military is Dangerous." We reached out to the two of them to ask if they'd be willing to talk with us about the ideas presented in that article, as well as the underlying research.
Dr. Ronald Krebs and Mr. Robert Ralston, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having us.
So Dr. Krebs, you're a professor who's been working in this field of study for 16 years. And Mr. Ralston, you're just getting started in your academic career. We're curious to hear from both of you how you originally became interested in studying national security policy.
Well, why don't I start things off? First of all, thank you so much for having both of us on the program. It's a great question. It's sort of one of those very basic questions. It's both very easy and very difficult. Let me tell you sort of the two sort of personal stories in a way that I think tell a little bit about why I became interested in this. The first is a very personal story. I'm the child of immigrants. My parents are both survivors of the Holocaust, and my father was a deeply conflicted liberal who worked for 40 years in the defense industry. So on the one hand, he thought government spending was very good. On the other hand, he wished it wasn't in defense. On the other hand, he needed it to be in defense in order to keep his job. And so the defense industry and national security policy were, for very personal reasons, both economic and in terms of personal narrative, never far from the table at which I grew up. But I think really crucial for me was that I came of age, and now, as you've already revealed that I've been in this business for 16 years, people can calculate that I came of age just as the Cold War was coming to an end. The Berlin Wall came down. Amidst my high school career, the Soviet Union collapsed just as I was finishing my high school career and beginning my college career. And many people reacted to the end of the Cold War, as we have now been reminded with the recent passing of George H.W. Bush, with the great dreams that we were on the verge of a new and more peaceful and more cooperative world order. It was a time of great hope in the early 1990s. But I perceived somehow intuitively that this was really overly optimistic. And so I gravitated immediately toward questions of the use of force in national security policy.
Cool. Mr. Ralston, how about you?
Well, my story is it's not nearly as interesting as Ron's, but the second part of Ron's story about growing up during a formative sort of time in world politics resonates with me as well. I can probably trace my interest back to witnessing 9/11 and the subsequent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq as a high schooler and as someone who was thinking about attending college. And when I started my undergraduate career in international relations, it really sort of piqued my interest in studying these topics more systematically and coming up with my own ways of studying national security policy. That was always something that interested me as an undergraduate. And so I've just sort of continued on from there. And so that's how I came about it.
In your article, you give a brief summary of the classic model of civ-mil relations. For our listeners who might not be familiar, what is that prevailing theory, and why does it matter?
Great question. In the early years of the Cold War, people, as the U.S., what would come to be known as the military-industrial complex, really got going, people started to become newly attentive to the implications of what it would mean to have a very large, wealthy, and powerful military. And how do you maintain a democracy when you have a military that necessarily is spanning the globe, that has an organization composed of millions of people? The central problem of civil-military relations, as it has come to be understood, is the problem of who guards the guardians. How do we ensure that those very individuals who are responsible for maintaining the safety and security of this nation, and the safety and security of all of us, that they themselves do not become an utterly unaccountable elite? And this was a central problem in the 1950s. And a young Harvard professor named Samuel Huntington took this on in a foundational text called The Soldier and the State. And Huntington's text, which continues to be widely read, Huntington's text laid out what today is known as that kind of normal theory of civil-military relations, which says that the way in which we ensure that the military can ensure both our security but remain in its proper place is by promoting military professionalism. That it is the responsibility of the military, that we have to give to the military their area of expertise, which is tactics and operations, but it is to the military must leave it to civilians to design the goals toward which military force is put, and ultimately even the strategy. That is, how is it that military force can be most effectively used to further those ends? Huntington's view, which is today sort of widely accepted and what is taught in all the military academies as sort of the standard view, Huntington's view was not, of course, universally accepted. There was a great military sociologist at the University of Chicago named Morris Janowitz, who laid out a view that, in fact, the best way to ensure that the military would remain loyal to democracy was by, in fact, deeply politicizing the military, that is, teaching them the virtues of democracy. But that was not the sort of the standard view.
Why is it, would you say, that Huntington's view became the standard view and other views like Janowitz went into the background?
I think that what really turned the tables there was an understanding as people looked, especially in the developing world in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, in that post-colonial world, and saw a world rife with coups d'etat. And coups d'etat that were conducted by the military in the name of the nation. These were deeply, and so they looked at Janowitz, and this is the danger. If you politicize the military and they see a corrupt civilian elite, they will say, we know better than the civilians, and they will choose to take over governments from them. And so I think there was a general sense that this is not the direction that we wanted to go, and that therefore the Huntingtonian view was a safer understanding. Today, where you hear critique of the Huntingtonian view, it does not come from that old Janowitzian perspective that we need to really, in fact, get the military more politically committed to democracy. You, in fact, hear the critique from the other side. And this isn't a critique from the left, it's a critique even from the right. Elliot Cohen, a longtime Republican national security hand, wrote a wonderful book critiquing that prevailing theory of civil-military relations, where he argued that, in fact, we need civilians. There's no inherent reason, especially in the modern military, there's no inherent reason that civilians need to leave very much of a realm of autonomous expertise for the military at all. Cohen's view, looking back over the history of civil-military relations, was that sometimes civilians who get involved in tactics and operations have better judgment than the military, the professional military. And he would draw upon examples like Lincoln, David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel. None of these, Franklin Roosevelt, these individuals did not particularly give a great deal of autonomous space to the military. The question that you asked earlier is why is this good? Why do we care about civil-military relations? It takes us back to that question about who guards the guardians. That what is the military, the fear of an unaccountable military elite is what drives the theory, any theory of civil-military relations. That what is the military's claim that its judgment should transcend that of civilians? In response to our piece, I've received, as you can imagine, a number of emails asking me, do civilians really make better decisions systematically than the military? I think that the jury is out on that, but the real question is better by whose lights? Who gets to decide that those decisions are better? If our civilian leaders make decisions that we as the mass populace deem to be poor ones, and those are salient and really costly decisions, well, we get to vote them out of office. But how do we hold the military accountable if we give the military if we're very deferential to the military? It's a very difficult thing, and that's why that's why getting this right, if you will, debating these questions about civil-military relations really matters.
Robert, we'll go to you for this next question. So you and Dr. Krebs are in the midst of researching the American public's attitudes towards military and civilian leadership, as we've talked about. And we were wondering if you could tell us about this research project and what motivated you to pursue it.
Yeah, that's a great question. And what Ron just referenced as being this really fundamental question about how deferential the public is to the military. We don't really have good survey data on this. And there was one exception done, and that is by Corey Shakey and the Hoover Institution in 2013. And that data was featured in a foreign policy article and a book alongside General Mattis. And the Corey Shakey found that 41% of the public believed that the president should manage the broad objectives but leave the details of military plans to the generals. In other words, this distinction between whether to use force or whether to engage in force, and the sort of tactical and operational decisions that we think the military